Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you might be. I'm Safwan Masri. I'm Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development at Columbia University. And it's truly my pleasure to welcome and thank you for joining us on behalf of all of us at Columbia University. This webinar series is part of the Global Columbia Collaboratory, an educational program launched last summer and designed to give undergraduate students the skills, understanding, and networks to grow into the leaders our world needs, to thoroughly and thoughtfully address our increasingly complex challenges. The struggle to secure rights for LGBTQ+ individuals is hardly new. Queer people across the world have been persecuted for decades by politicians, religious zealots, and other authoritarians keen to scapegoat them. Queer people were, and in too many parts of the world today still are, denied jobs and housing, disowned by families, shunned by neighbors. Throughout history, the price paid for being queer was steep and well documented, from blackmail and extortion to imprisonment, torture, and execution. And yet, as far as historically marginalized and despised groups are concerned, LGBTQ+ individuals continue to demonstrate extraordinary resilience. Over the course of the past half century, in particular, this community has dared to increase its visibility, declare its right to exist, and demand equality. But in the Arab world, in 2021, the stakes associated with declaring one's sexual orientation, much less becoming a public advocate for expanded LGBTQ+ rights, remains high. Convicted acts of homosexuality are still punishable by death in 7 Arab countries. Across the region, laws regulating sexual conduct may be outdated, hypocritical, flouted, and inconsistently enforced, but they're still on the books. At a societal level, inside mosques, churches, communities, and homes, the Arab world remains a laggard when it comes to acceptance. But something has been shifting, slowly but noticeably. It is my contention that queer activist voices have grown louder in recent years. Beginning a decade ago, with the uprisings that became known as the Arab Spring, the citizens of the region demanded expansion of political and economic freedoms for all. Yet many of those who embraced and advocated for liberal political ideals remained stubbornly conservative when it came to social issues, especially in their attitudes towards sexuality and identity. How is it queer activists began to ask their fellow citizens, you can demand freedom for all, yet still insist on restricting freedoms for some? To state it politely, the activist community dared the region's inhabitants to reconcile contradictory attitudes and impulses. To state it more plainly, the activists started calling their Arab brothers and sisters bluff. Today, marginalized groups and individuals that historically lurked in subcultures are now asserting themselves. They're seizing the opportunity to demand more freedom of thought, belief, and conscience. They are claiming the right to culturally express their unique sexual and gender identities without fear of censure from not only governmental and religious authorities, but also from their fellow citizens. And perhaps no incident in recent memory provided more inspiration and impetus to continue that march than Sarah Hegazi's death on June 14, 2020. In 2017, while attending a concert in Cairo performed by Mashrou' Layla, whose lead singer, Hamed Sinno, is openly gay, 27-year-old Sarah was photographed smiling and dancing under a rainbow flag. After the concert, she and scores of other men and women suspected of homosexuality was arrested. She was imprisoned and tortured for 3 months. Following her release, she began struggling with depression and PTSD. And then, sadly, a year ago, she committed suicide. We honor Sarah Hegazi today, for she is, on one hand, a martyr to the enduring hate, repression, and intolerance we are compelled to eradicate. And on the other hand, she is a catalyst and symbol of hope. At a personal level, I did not know Sarah Hegazi, but I know her pain only too well. And I know many LGBTQ people who are Sarah Hegazi. In a region that doesn't want to acknowledge LGBTQ plus people exist, she is now a venerated name and face of a cohort of people her oppressors would prefer remain nameless and faceless. But as the convening of this panel today demonstrates, the oppressor's wishes will not be indulged. Which brings me to introductions. Our panel will be moderated by Kendall Thomas, Nash Professor of Law at Columbia Law School, a scholar of comparative constitutional law and human rights. His teaching and research focus on critical race theory, legal philosophy, feminist legal theory, and law and sexuality. Professor Thomas has taught at Columbia since 1986. He has been a visiting professor at Stanford Law School and at Princeton University. The first out gay professor at Columbia Law School and the second African-American member of the faculty, Kendall has brought a pioneering spirit and a critical perspective to his work over nearly 4 decades as a teacher, scholar, activist, and artist. Kendall will be in conversation with Dalia Al-Faghal, who is LGBTQ plus defender and human rights activist, born and raised in Saudi Arabia to Egyptian parents. Welcome, Dalia. Hamdi Khalifa is a founding member and former bureau member of 2 LGBTQI organizations in Tunisia, Damj and Arkan for Minorities. Welcome, Hamdi. Rasha Younes is a researcher with the LGBT rights program at Human Rights Watch, investigating abuses against LGBT people in the Middle East and North Africa region. Rasha, we're delighted to have you with us. Then there is Tariq Zaidan, who is executive director at Hilm, the first LGBT rights organization in the Arab world, founded in Beirut in 2000. Tariq holds an MPA in human rights law and advocacy from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Tariq will be joining us later in the webinar. Our distinguished moderator and panelists have a lot of ground to cover over the next 90 minutes. They'll talk about current laws targeting queer people, as well as the complex legal frameworks in which they must navigate to drive reform. They'll discuss their efforts to build regional and global alliances with a focus on the particularities of LGBTQ plus activism in the region. I expect we'll hear inspiring as well as harrowing personal stories about the activists' journeys from agony to agency and from isolation to engagement. Our panelists will also explain how art and culture have been and can be harnessed and deployed for the purpose of targeted advocacy and driving change. My wish for us is that as a result of this discussion, we will all have a deeper understanding of what has worked, what hasn't, why, and what's next. So let's get started. Kendall, over to you, my friend.
Thank you very much, Safwan. It's my honor and pleasure to have been asked to moderate this discussion with these extraordinary young people who are doing such important work on the front lines of the global and regional social movements to secure the recognition and respect and rights of LGBTQ plus people in the Arab world. I'm going to get right into the conversation since there are so many issues to discuss, as Safwan so beautifully laid out in his powerful introduction of the themes that have motivated this discussion today. So I want to just do around the question of your work and the advocacy and activism in which you are currently engaged where you are, that aims to advance the freedom of LGBTQI plus people And I will start, with your permission, with Hamdi.
Hi, thank you everyone for having me here. Um, so a little bit about me. I'm a Tunisian LGBTQ activist, human rights activist based in Tunisia currently. My most recent contribution as part of this community, I participated in the creation and founding of a regional organization called NEXAP, North African Center for Strategic Partnership. This is a new
Hamdi,
yes.
could you put the microphone closer to your mouth, please?
Yeah, you may have to hold it.
You may have to hold
Okay.
it. Yes.
Yeah.
No problem. Is this better?
Yes.
Much better. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to repeat from the beginning again. A little bit more about me. I'm Tunisian. I'm based in Tunisia. I'm a human rights and LGBTIQ activist. My latest contribution to the movement here is my work on a country report for an international organization on the Tunisian LGBTIQ plus movement for the last 10 years since the revolution. As we commemorate 10 years of this democratic transition is still going on. This has been an amazing opportunity for me to work with all actors and their allies and provide recommendations. An additional thing that I've participated in is the Colors of April cultural event that is organized by the Tunisian Center in Tunisia. This is an event a week-long event that celebrates diversity and LGBTIQ issues. And one of the panel that I was part of talked about growing up gay, and it tackled the issues of senior citizens who are LGBTIQ people, and comparing the Tunisian experience from my own experience, because I've led a small short research on that with the French one. And on that, I'm a co-founder of and a board member of NEXAP, which is the North African Center for Strategic Partnership, which is an regional organization focusing on LGBTIQ issues in North Africa.
Thank you, Hamdi. Rasha, would you like to tell us a bit about the work that you've been doing?
Sure. Thank you, Kendall. Hi, everyone. My name is Rasha Younes. I'm the LGBT rights researcher covering the Middle East and North Africa at Human Rights Watch. Our work has ranged from covering specific country issues, such as the impact of criminalization on LGBTIQ plus people, torture and detention in both Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and other places across the region. We've talked about and written about the closing of spaces across the region in places like Tunisia, Algeria, and Lebanon, where security forces have cracked down on any organizing around gender and sexuality with total impunity. We've also, launched campaigns, which Dalia was a part of one of our campaigns, basically directed at young LGBT people to remind them that they're not alone in the struggles that they're facing, and kind of act as an educational tool for individuals. Our current work focuses on digital surveillance around the region against LGBT people by governments. This is such an urgent topic, especially in the last year during the pandemic, when governments have increasingly relied on digital surveillance tactics to both police free speech and to arbitrarily arrest, entrap, and detain LGBT people. Another project that I'm working on at the moment is around the killings of LGBT plus people in Iraq by armed groups, as well as detention and arbitrary arrests and torture in detention by state actors and security forces. So that's just briefly, but I'm looking forward to getting into the discussion with you.
Thank you. Dalia, a word from you about your work, please.
Yes, of course. I've been doing my work, had different phases, because when I started working, I was working with an LGBTQ platform called Ahwa. I was an editor there for almost 2 years. Afterwards, I started an initiative together with other activists in 2014 after an incident called Hammam Bab al-Bahr, or it's a public bath that was cracked down on, and it became a quite big deal. Back in 2014, many people were detained, so we were organizing campaigns talking about these people and trying to raise awareness about the situation, not declaring that they are queer, but just focusing on the fact that they were just people that fell victim to media to frame LGBTQ people. And yeah, we were also supporting people with legal support. Like we were having like some network of lawyers. We were connecting them with the people who were detained. And I continued working on that line for some time, creating awareness and advocacy. Afterwards, I mean, I joined another initiative called No Hate Egypt. You can look it up. We are kind of pausing right now because we don't have the mental capacity to continue working what we're doing, but it was also focusing on raising awareness about different kind of human rights issues or events taking place in Egypt connected to gender-based violence, hate crimes. And right now, like, I mean, since 2017, I didn't really effectively choose to be out, but I became out. It was a very strange situation that I posted something on Facebook, and then it went viral, and then I had to respond to that, and it went on and on. That was just a few months before raising the flag at Mashrua Layla's. And yeah, since then I've been like talking publicly, raising awareness, but more with myself, helping LGBTQ people on the ground, connecting them with each other, kind of creating community. Yeah, and creating content basically on my social media channels. That's it.
Thank you very much. I've noticed already the emergence of some terms that I'd like to focus on for a bit in our conversation. Hamdi, you used the word movement. And Dalia, you used a couple of terms. One was human rights, and the other was community. And Rasha, I noticed that one of the focuses of your work is young people, and young people who are isolated and disconnected from a larger queer public. So I'd like to talk about naming and framing and the ways in which it has been important for you to think about how to name and frame the challenges that you face in the context in which you are doing your work, and the connection between that naming and framing work and the fashioning of specific practices and strategies to address those problems and to identify what the objectives of your advocacy ought to be. We are using some terms: queer, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, plus, which have been forged in a very different context, perhaps, than the contexts in which you're doing your work. And you're using other terms that resonate for me in a very specific way. And so there are translation problems or questions about translation. There are questions about what works in specific cultural and social contexts for different activists and groups, and how we should think about objectives, specific objectives in particular contexts. So what are some of the practices that you found have been useful for you in naming and framing problems and in responding to the challenges that you have described? Why don't we start with you, Dalia? You're muted, Dalia. Yeah.
Well, the language question is very important, and I think it's one of the biggest challenges that also has a cultural connotation because, well, I mean, one of the main reasons a lot of people do not relate to individuals from the LGBTQ community is that it doesn't translate into something that we've been or we were aware of since long ago, or that we are surrounded by in any context. So it's quite difficult for that specific reason that we have to translate and educate, and that's a lot of efforts. Like we need to make the society get used to the recent work, the recent translation work that's been going on the past years, which has been fascinating, of course, but like if we look at it from a time perspective, a lot of content has been created in Arabic language, and people now are getting to know more, but the thing is still kind of elitist, so it's kind of is kind of difficult, but we're getting there, and I think once terminologies and stories and narratives have been controlled and later normalized, I think there will be much more hope for the movement, because it's all about awareness and normalization after all.
Mm-hmm.
So answering the language question, you asked another question, but I kind of shortly lost track.
Well, what are some of the best practices that you have found work in terms of how to name problems and how to frame solutions in a way that speaks effectively to the situation in which you're doing your work and to the constituencies that you're trying to address?
If I would speak about it, I would speak about it from a personal perspective, and also like from like some of the previous work I've been doing. I mean, best practices now are different from best practices in the past years. And well, I think it's very important, as Rasha mentioned, that we focus on digital security, because it's one of the challenges that we are facing right now. So this is the first thing to do, because a lot of people are getting targeted through these tools. That's one thing. Another thing is creating awareness. I mean, like there are stuff that are concerning the LGBTQ community, and others are more focused on how the society is supposed to perceive them, and other parts are legal. So I mean, speaking of Egypt, well, I think the surveillance part is quite important for the community. So creating a community is very important for the community, because one of the reasons a lot of people are kind of falling victims to state violation, all this, because there is no like communal space where people can actually exchange experiences and warn each other from what to do, and give each other tips about how to navigate the state and how to protect themselves, and also have emotional support. Second most important, I think, or if it's not equally important to, I mean, training them to be more protected digitally, is mental health and psychological health. And that's pretty much an event that came after Sarah's death. A lot of LGBTQ people, individuals from Egypt, and actually the entire region, been struggling with accepting the idea of Sarah's death, especially that she managed to leave the country, yet she was still under the trauma that she had experienced, plus other personal reasons. But I mean, what they can see is that, or what they were able to see then and actually now, is that she ended her life, and that was quite traumatizing. So I think psychological mental support, especially for people who have suicidal thoughts, and in general, well-being is quite important. So I would say this is what is important now, plus creating awareness, but I don't know what comes first is very relative to who is talking. So
thank you. I'm going to ask Hamdi to come in, and you should feel free, all of you, to respond to what others have said in your own remarks.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to the same one of the points that Dalia raised. it's very important to have names, and it's an identity thing. That we all know that Tunisia has been going through a democratic transition since 2011. Before that, for LGBTIQ people, the approach was a health approach. It was not a human rights approach. So basically, they had to fit in, and they were called and labeled under different labels. They were men having sex with men, MSMs. They were trans people generically. There were other identities that are not the same one, as now we are going into this human rights centered approach. Now we're talking about LGBTIQ people as a community and as a movement, because we are focusing on their individual rights. And in general, this is very important because Tunisia, with its new constitution, its new parliament and different presidents and so on and so forth, and all these mechanisms around it, is trying to reinvent itself to focus on the citizen, so that everyone has equal rights. And this is very important in terms of naming. And it's also very important to have that internalized and embraced by the community members themselves. So now we're talking about, intersex people having their own organizations in Tunisia, for example, or trans people having their own organization. So every subgroup, quote unquote, has its specific needs and characteristics, and the bigger LGBT organization now that can cater to everyone, but also there are ones that are very specific to each community, and that's very important. And that's a very positive sign of growth and evolution. In terms of the best practices, I think capacity building is very important internally for the members of the community to know what are their rights, to know more about their rights, but also to know how to protect themselves, whether physically or at the digital level, of course. Also to build capacity for other organizations working on other causes that are somehow related to the LGBTIQ one. And that's for ally organization. And that's also, to go back to our original point about naming, one of the very first battles is not to refer to homosexuality as perversion or liwat, which is the Arabic word, but now we're talking about homosexuality as mithliya, which is a different term, which is not negative or derogatory. So that has been taken within, the civil society sphere, but also now the media use that word, and they gave up on using the word liwat, for example, and that's something that is very positive. So it's very important to have our names, to own them, to embrace them, and to use them, and to share that with the rest of the world, of course. Some of the best practices that help the movement is to really add to capacity building about the terminology, about how to protect ourselves and so on and so forth, is to take it to the next level, that is to take it to international level. And that's by building, strong ties with international organizations, whether human rights organizations or more specifically LGBTIQ organizations, and working with the UN and its agencies. Sometimes it does help. Case in point, last week we had the visit of the UN independent expert on SOGI here, and that was a unique opportunity for both LGBTIQ organizations and their allies to share their concerns, to report on the actual situation of the community members here, and to ask for the same requests and demands. So it's very important to have that one big alliance working together at the same time. Another one is to use some of the mechanisms. And I think one of them is the UPR and the different schedule reports drafted and written by the different organizations, including ally organizations that helped raise the same concerns. And the last thing is, of course, and I'm sure that Rasha here will relate a lot, is documentation of the different human rights violations against LGBTQ people, because it is more telling, it's more compelling. It really raises awareness about the gravity of the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. So, Rasha, we'll turn to you, and actually, I think we'll shift the question slightly, because Hamdi has talked about the role that international civil society and indeed the international state system can play in elevating and assisting this work around human rights in the MENA region for LGBTQI people. So what is something that you would want people who think in a global and regional frame about human rights generally and about the international queer civil society, what would you want some of these folks to change about how they think about LGBTQI issues in the Middle East, North Africa region?
Thank you, Kendall, Dalia, and Hamdi. This is a very important question. Thank you for asking it. Really, just going off of what Hamdi and Dalia have already said, language is very important in the region, and so is framing. So in terms of language, first changing the language that has historically been used in the Arabic language by activists, which has been ongoing for over a decade, is very significant, but also introducing new terms that distance themselves from the Western discourse that permeates from the international movement to the region. In a lot of ways, our framing around LGBT issues is that they are human rights issues. They are not any different from any human rights issues. Specifically in the MENA region, the discourse of identity does not really work. We cannot say that individuals' realities are determined by their sexual orientation or gender identity alone. There is a web of intersectional issues, including geopolitical climate, political strategies by governments, access to very basic rights such as employment, health, housing, that really shape the realities of LGBT+ people and do not, create the same type of quote unquote communities as they would in places where, LGBT+ people at least have, access to their rights on the books, even if they don't have, actual access to the rights. In the Middle East and North Africa region, saying community means that we're almost homogenizing an entire region in a shared interest that is based purely on sexual orientation and gender identity. We can talk about feminist and queer communities. We can definitely talk about political economic resistance and LGBT+ community. But basically saying, for example, that a transgender woman in Egypt who barely has access to employment is part of the same community as a gay man in Egypt who, has access to, social status, wealth, all the things that make people's lives easier in these contexts would be a disservice to clump both of these identities in one framework. So one thing that I would encourage when talking about this region is, first of all, not treating the region as a monolith. A question that I get asked all the time by journalists is, what does it mean to be gay in the Middle East? It's just a completely horrible question, because it's determining, first of all, that being gay is the reality of individuals in the region. It's also determining that the Middle East is a monolith where individuals have the same experiences. Their experiences are very much based on access to economic power, access to social status, the socioeconomic climate within which they are framed. Also, in terms of voting rights and treating LGBT+ people as an entity that could then as they do in the US, calling the LGBT vote. This doesn't apply to the region. We have contexts where we have authoritarian systems, we have sectarianism, we have all of these political paradigms that shape how LGBT+ people live their lives and how they form communities. So this is one thing. And another thing that I would like to comment on when it comes to civil society organizing is that, there's this accusation that, especially for organizations like Human Rights Watch, is that we are a Western agent trying to infiltrate, national affairs with ideas that are foreign to the region. This is absolutely not true, both in terms of discourse and in terms of movement shaping. One thing that activists have done remarkably well is distance themselves from this accusation and from this discourse, first by developing things like dictionaries and language that is based on their contextual lived experience, not something that is imported from the West. And second is by distancing themselves from you know, sources of funding that might not align with their movements, distancing themselves from you know, ideas on how movements are built that are very separate from the West. So there's an intentionality with you know, combating this, and this is also with partnerships. We as Human Rights Watch cannot do our work without partnering with civil society organizations on the ground. We need to first use our platform in places where individuals cannot, due to security reasons and, you know, and access to resources, document and expose the violations that are happening against them. So our role is to really act as a medium to then, you know, transmit these voices on a platform that we know is a privilege in terms of accessing, you know, knowledge production and how the world receives this information. But at the same time, strategically deciding when to intervene and when not to. You know, this is another thing that would be kind of a word of advice. A lot of the time, private advocacy goes a long way, and speaking on behalf of groups without consulting them in advance could really backfire. A lot of the time, you know, we spoke about visibility. Visibility is not necessarily the strategy to move forward with. A lot of the time, our demands are not necessarily, you know, as much as decriminalization is important, in some aspects, in some contexts in the region, decriminalizing or basically repealing laws that vaguely, you know, criminalize same-sex relations in climates where, you know, parliament and government actors are not ready to then introduce laws that are affirmative, it risks introducing laws in contexts like Lebanon, for example, that determine specifically that same-sex acts are criminalized. In a lot of ways, decriminalization is definitely the end goal, but we need protection. We need access to very basic services. And that's what shapes the strategy of the region and how we discuss LGBT plus issues in the region. It is not according to an identity paradigm. So that's just the main takeaway on that question.
Mm-hmm. So let me pick up on the point that you've just made about the need to be mindful and conscious of the consequences of a law reform strategy, right? And the limits of law, because from the West, if I can speak in such monolithic terms, there is this impulse really to accord pride of place to a rights discourse that is framed very much in terms of law and legal reform. So I'd like to get a sense from all of you, since I am a law professor, about what Janet Halley and Wendy Brown, two pioneering writers in queer theory and left political theory, have called legalism as a strategy, as a political strategy. How does one first think where you are about engaging with the law and legal reform as a social movement strategy? And secondly, about giving an account to international or Western human rights and queer advocacy groups of why they should not assume that leading with the law and leading with the language of rights is going to be the most effective way tactically to help you do your work and to address the challenges that you want to address where you are. Hamdi, can we go to you with this question, and then I'll follow up with you about some of the specifics in Tunisia.
Absolutely. Let's face it, the legal approach is one approach. It's not every single possible way to tackle this big fight. And it has one end, that is changing the law. But let's face it, changing the law is part of the fight. Changing the attitudes is the bigger one and the long-term one. And yeah, I think homophobic people, homophobes, they use the law to justify their acts. But without the law, many people will be still killed no matter what. And we know that in many countries that decriminalize homosexuality, and especially in the US, we know that trans people are targeted quite frequently. So it's not only the law that's going to change attitude, it's many other things. And that's why it's very important to have an organic approach to everything that is based on intersectionalities, including everyone in this fight and tackling it from different aspects, from education, from the health approach, from media, from arts, different things, so that people change their perception and have a more perception of LGBTQ people far away from the typical stereotypes. So that's something. And I think some steps have been done in Tunisia, but we can talk about this later on. But we have, a new constitution that is quite progressive and should be able to protect everyone's right, every citizen here, regardless of their sexual orientation and gender expressions. But that's remained, unfortunately, theoretic, because the other laws have not changed, and they're not following with this change. So there is a big gap between the two, and the mechanism that is supposed to bridge that gap is not established as per now because of different factors, which is the constitutional court. So that's all I can say about the Tunisian experience.
Well, let's follow up a little bit and get a little more specific. I think you've just pointed up something that our audience may not entirely understand. So there are inherent contradictions in the laws that govern Tunisian society. So, for example, you referenced the Constitution. Article 6 of the Tunisian Constitution, the 2014 Constitution, guarantees freedom of conscience for all Tunisian citizens. And yet you have a penal code, a criminal law code provision, Penal Code 230, which criminalizes homosexuality. So that contradiction is a legal problem, as you say, but it's also a political and cultural problem. So what I find really interesting about what you're identifying is the importance of cultural strategies and of cultural politics that engage with the law, but understand that the larger challenge is to change hearts and minds and attitudes and the ways in which people imagine sexuality and imagine LGBTQ plus Tunisian citizens. And so let's talk a little bit about that imaginal politics, if I can use that phrase, and the cultural work that you see as so important. What are some of the places, some of the platforms, and some of the creative opportunities that are available to you to do some of this cultural organizing, which doesn't seek so much necessarily to change the law as an immediate strategy, but as more of a long-term strategy, and focuses in the short term on trying to produce and disseminate different narratives, different stories, different images, different understandings of the lived experience of Tunisian citizens who are sexual and gender minorities.
Now, this is an extremely important point. I would like to kind of point out a couple of things about the Constitution and the different laws, and then I'll get back to your question. The Tunisian Constitution has Article 6 about freedom of belief, conscience, and all that, but has a few other ones that are really pro-freedom, individual liberties, and all the wonderful things that we want to have in our new society, including Article 21, which is about equal rights and duties for everyone without any discrimination. Article 23 is about protection of human dignity and physical integrity. Now in Tunisia, in order to incriminate someone with homosexuality, we have forced anal examinations. I don't know whether if this article is in sync with the Penal Code or not, but obviously there is some problems here. It also prohibits mental and physical torture. Article 24 is about the right to privacy. And Article 46 is basically protecting women's rights. And does that include trans rights, trans women's rights? I'm not sure of that part. So this is one of the problems that we're facing between the Constitution and the old laws, because these laws belong to a different time, a different era. It is post-independence society where everything was about regulating the public space. So what you have now, more individualistic society, more freedom, personal freedoms. So we have to readjust that. To go back to your question, it's very, very important to have self-representation and own that instead of being represented by other people. And that's the whole, bigger issue. And I think some of the most creative ones have been like arts and culture. In Tunisia, for instance, we have two very fascinating cultural events. One of them is a feminist festival organized by the feminist LGBTIQ organization, Shuf, and that works on gender, feminism, and LGBTIQ issues. And the other one is the Mawjoudeen Queer Film Festival, and that's another opportunity for people to not only come together from different backgrounds and walks of life, but also to see and to talk and discuss different topics. It's very, very important to have that because it kind of consolidates intersectionality. All the work that has been done between different movements, whether it's the health movement and HIV and AIDS, or feminism, or disability, and all these things, so that people talk about these and see that everyone can relate and identify. So it's very important to have that for inclusion, representation, talking about new topics, but also bring it together the old generation and the new generation of activists, which is very important too. So at an internal level, it's very important to have that. And also unifying the same voice, calling for the same rights and demands. So that's what has been done in terms of creative approaches that have been publicly accepted, of course.
Thank you so much. Dalia and Rasha, I'd like you to talk a little bit about this question of the role that creative expression, arts and culture can play as a resource for resistance to repression, but also for more affirmative, productive, transformative work around questions of gender and sexual freedom. How do you think about these questions, about the ways in which arts and culture can allow people to say and do work and to raise issues and engage in practices of representation, to use Hamdi's self-representation, to use Hamdi's phrase, that law and policy may not? Rasha, actually, I'll start with you, Dalia, and then go to Rasha.
Well, a very interesting question. Yet I don't know if it could be applicable in Egypt, because it's not allowed to talk even remotely about queer identities in on Egyptian media platforms. So I wouldn't say that this is something that is doable. Yet there are many other ways to do so through creating content on social media, and I think this is the most revolutionary thing that has been going on for some years now. That is kind of replacing the lack of media content or any kind of art expression, and we have a lot in common as a region, Arabic-speaking region. those who speak Arabic or align more with the ethnic background of others. So a lot relate to other people's work, like some work that would be done in Tunisia would be relevant to people in Egypt. Some work will be done in Lebanon will be also relevant to people in Egypt. So, I mean, we are quite like we are dependent on each other. We are dependent on each other's work and culture work as well. I mean, yet I don't know if it's mainstream, but learning how to speak about yourself and how to express yourself and feel comfortable with yourself helps you with finding ways to express yourself better. And I think this is an indirect impact of having already like being exposed to different formats of culture content and media content, that you would get to a point that you find your way to speak to your society, since we cannot speak to the society directly, or it always seems to be like kind of an identity politics fight that we have to exist, and this is how we are, and we are replicas of people in the Western world who identify the same as we do, and it's homo nationalism, and that we don't have anything to connect with the society. So it's kind of still information, but I think what goes beyond is that we have the essence of culture and language somehow in common or aligned-ish. I don't know, I wouldn't say that, but I mean, we have much more in common than what we have with the West. So I think it's if one organization's work, one country's work is going to be impactful and will impact the rest. So, yeah.
Great. Rasha, would you like to come in on this issue of arts and culture?
Yeah, thank you, Kendall. I'd actually like to point to revolutions that have taken place across the region in the past decade. We saw during these revolutions that art mediums were one of the primary ways through which LGBT+ rights were mainstreamed across general publics. So in places like Lebanon, we saw, chanting and graffiti as one of the primary ways to show visibility around LGBT+ issues without necessarily having, to put individuals in a place where they have to declare themselves anything before they are able to introduce their demands to the public. And this created, specifically in spatiality, with a city that has historically been sectarian and divided, to have joint demands on walls in downtown Beirut, which is probably the most privatized space in the entirety of the country, really speak to each other. It was like creating language on the walls, creating mediums through which individuals can share ideas and be exposed to ideas that are in artistic form without having to, react to them individually. So it also normalized this mainstreaming of LGBT+ rights as, part and parcel and central to the revolution that everyone else was leading, and allowed people to meet each other, to ask questions. What does Article 534 mean? Why are we asking for us to abolish it? How does chanting permeate when crowds, thousands of people are following chants by, for example, a queer woman who is then, after saying we need to abolish sectarianism, says we need to abolish, criminalization of homosexuality, and people repeat. And what is this repetition, and what does it create within a cultural medium? In places also like Dalia mentioned, where arts and culture and kind of discussion of LGBT+ issues is not allowed. All of this, and we've seen this also in places like Tunisia and Lebanon and Jordan that are more or less seen from a Western lens as more quote unquote liberal or open. Security forces and governments are so threatened by forms of expression around gender and sexuality that they have led campaigns to arrest organizers of events like galleries around representation of gender and sexuality in the region. Conferences that are speaking about the intersection of activism and art. These forms of expression are so central to the way that we, communicate with each other and network, that governments like Egypt, for example, completely prohibit this kind of exchange because it is the way through which we will be able to communicate, our needs and demands in an emotive and relevant way to our lived experiences, to the general public that is primarily uninformed and homophobic in the sense that the middle class is very much following the government discourse and what they tell them about morality and about what it means to be outsider or queer in societies. But really, if we are given the tools through art to be able to communicate what it really means for us to be queer and trans in the region, it could really create a shift that is much needed. And there are spaces in the region where this is happening very actively. In Lebanon, there's an organization called Haven for Artists that specifically focuses on how to communicate queer identities through art and how to empower artists to also be able to do the work of changing minds and hearts through mediums such as this.
So that suggests to me that, again, I'm talking to someone with Human Rights Watch, that there may be some potential use of the international human rights documents that talk not about sexuality and gender rights, but rather about cultural rights. I'm thinking, for example, of Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says that everyone has the right to participate in the cultural life of their community and to have access to the arts, right? So in contexts where you can be arrested for singing, right, to hold up the right to participate in culture and rights of creative cultural expression may, in that context, be doing LGBTQ advocacy work in ways that to people from outside that context are not apparent. And so I'd like to ask you all a question about, because you've all been talking in one way or another about straddling or overcoming borders and connecting and tapping into work done in one place from another place. How should we think about this work, which is not so categorical, but is contextual, not about formally naming or claiming identities, again, but thinking functionally, tactically, strategically, situationally, creatively about the opportunities that present themselves to do LGBTQ work in places and through modes of expression that are about something else. I hope I've framed that question in ways that get through to you. What would you say to that, Rasha? And then I'll come to the rest of you.
This has been really a very intentional paradigm for civil society and also for international organizations like Human Rights Watch. Film festivals, we had a film festival also as much as Mawjoudeen does this work in Tunisia. We've also had film festivals in Lebanon that are supposed to be regional film festivals that could only take place at the French embassy in Beirut because of reduced security risk that general security forces could just barge into the film festival and shut it down. So in that way, it's unfortunate that we do need to sometimes rely on specific spaces to be able to do this work, but also goes to show how important it is to even have a film festival on queer issues that very much is discussing the individual and lived realities of people who have been through war, of people who have been through, political strife, of people who have tried to organize revolutions, of the realities of transgender women who, cannot find jobs. It's really this representation is the most real and authentic representation of the lived realities of individuals, because it is uncensored, it is unfiltered, it is not jargony, and it's not related to a specific rights discourse. It is a mode of expression that, just very outright shows kind of the raw realities of people without having to paint it around a specific relevant topic to the international community. I mean, at Human Rights Watch, the non-traditional products that we've done, so we did a web feature on Lebanon and the mainstreaming of LGBT plus rights, which is a bunch of videos of queer and trans women speaking about their work in revolutions without really mentioning anything about their sexual orientation and gender identity, unless they want to. It is really as individuals who are positioned in this place, how they have interacted with the larger public and the larger movement. Also goes to show that we don't need to divorce gender and sexuality from the lived realities of individuals for them to be topics of gender and sexuality. Topics of gender and sexuality permeate throughout all of our identities. They're not a hierarchy of identities. I'm a woman first and queer second, and whatever that is. They all intersect with each other in ways that really determine our access in our societies. And it's not an imagined or an imagined ideal that we need to deconstruct. It's very much what we are experiencing on a daily basis. So just briefly, I'll hand it over to other panelists. I feel like I'm speaking too much.
Kendall, if I may.
Yes, please, Safwan.
Yeah, thank you. First, I wanted to welcome Tariq Zaidan from Beirut, one of the co-founders of Hilm. It's nice to have you. And I know, Kendall, we want to maybe hear from Dalia, because I saw that, Dalia, you were ready to say something, and maybe hear from Tariq, and then we have some really good questions in the Q&A function. But I wonder, Kendall, if I could pose a question to the panelists. I mean, I'm listening to this exchange, and I'm in awe, and have been in awe, actually, with, of the tremendous courage and energy youth throughout the region have been exhibiting. And it sort of makes me wonder, and I have my thoughts, but I'd like to hear from you, if you don't mind, and you don't have to answer this now, but perhaps in addressing some of the other questions, you may integrate this in, and that is the generational issue. How can people of my generation, play a role that helps and facilitates, but does not in any way appropriate the great work that you are doing? I grew up in a very different Middle East region, and I see sort of a responsibility that I place on myself, and others of my generation also feel the same kind of responsibility, because we have witnessed a lot, and in many ways we're guilty of having allowed society in our region to get to the point where it has, in terms of its intolerance and deterioration and so on and so forth. So let me just leave you with that, perhaps, and I know Dalia wants to say something, and Tariq should have a chance to say a couple of things, and Kendall, back to you to deal with the questions from the audience. Have you had a chance to see them?
I am looking at some of them, but I want to make sure that we address this question of intergenerational alliances, interaction, and support, because it's also very much a question here in the United States that has to do with the role of older activists in the movement for Black lives. The younger people are rejecting the frame of civil rights that organized the Black and other POC freedom struggles when I was young, in favor of a language of human rights that a lot of older people don't understand. So we were talking about this languaging question, this naming and framing question earlier, but we will get to this question, Safwan, of how that's also a site of intergenerational misunderstanding and understanding. But Dalia, I want to go to you, and then Tariq, welcome, and we'll come to you to address anything you've been hearing or anything that you wanted to bring to the conversation. So Dalia, and then Tariq.
So sorry, Dalia. I'm not interrupting you. I just need to go. So I just want to say goodbye to everyone and thank you so much for holding this panel. I look forward to listening to the recording and your further responses.
Thank you, Rasha. Bye. Dalia.
Yes. Yeah, I was actually responding to the question you asked earlier to Rasha, and I think I mean, I wouldn't say that it has proven to be the most functional way to create content that is solely and intentionally talking about LGBTQ issues. It just doesn't work. It doesn't even work for the LGBTQ community. And since we spoke about that it's not a one paradigm and we shouldn't generalize, we're talking to different intersections and different interests even. I mean, so I would say that it's quite important to be relevant as much as possible and talk about intersectional problems as well, such as gender-based violence. Like right now in Egypt, there've been a lot of gender-based violence taking place and a lot of cases, and people are talking about it. Even LGBTQ people are engaging in the topic because it's relevant to them. It intersects with one or more of their identities, and it's like I think creating content or like creating culture. I think culture now is kind of taking a different path globally, and we need to kind of think outside the box and see like that there is already a lot of content and a lot of different forms of art, like different art that what we are used to. It's not what we are used to believe it's art. We can see it on Instagram, TikTok, like YouTube, and it's not intentional. It's actually bringing a lot of viewers, and it's making people get to the idea, or like, again, I was mentioned the term normalize, because normalization is quite important. Once you get people normalized to certain terminologies, to certain behaviors, etc., you kind of subconsciously make them accept different identities around them. I have a couple of friends who are comedians. They're both non-heterosexual, and they are really, they are not out, and they do a lot of really funny videos online, and they get a lot of engagement, and they're quite popular, and a lot of people are loving them. So it's kind of normalizing queer identities within the society and other queer people, because a lot of queer people I know look up to them, and it's quite visible to a queer person. Like the moment you see them, you know. But actually they are like getting a lot of positive attention from the society, which is something that is, I mean, if I saw it, like that would have never happened 10 years ago, for example. So the existence of many non-activist queer people who create really good content, regardless of what do we want to propagate through the content we are creating. It's like they're focusing on both. They have the skills, because it's quite important to mention skills. They have skills and they have the platform, and they are very smart about it, and they know how to create that. So I think the best way is to support these people and help them create content that is like, let them do it themselves, like, but kind of assist them and engage them in different platforms, kind of supporting them financially, etc., to help them communicate the messages that we want to communicate to the society. I mean, I think they are doing that already very well, but I think it's very important as well to support them in any form. So yeah, myself, I don't believe in intentional content. I don't watch it myself. I mean, unless I'm forced to, or like someone told me, what do you think about that? Can you watch it, please? I'm like, okay. I know I've done that before. So yeah, I mean, I think virality and relevance are quite important. Either you are creating content for queer people or any kind of society, you need to be relevant.
Thank you. Tarek, it's wonderful to have you here. You are with Helm, based in Lebanon, the Arab world's second LGBTQ plus civil society organization. And we were talking earlier about the pros and cons of a social movement approach that leads with law and legal reform and the language of rights. Our viewers and listeners may not know that Helm exists in a state of legal limbo because its application for registration has been ignored by the Lebanese state authorities. And so the question I would ask for you is the general question: how are you able to operate within this restrictive legal space? And then to connect it to the conversation we've been having, has cultural politics been a resource, a tool, or a strategy on which you've relied to address the constraints that have been put on you by the absence of formal legal recognition?
Well, thank you so much for having me. And sorry, I joined in late. That's because we had to shift the timing and the date of this event. So thank you very much for you and for Colombia for sticking to its guns and keeping this event going despite reservations from certain homophobic actors back in the region. It's really a pleasure for me to be here. And I'm going to try to answer 3 questions in one and try to sort of seamlessly integrate them through. The first has to do with this issue of registration. So Helm was actually the first LGBTQ rights organization to be founded in late 2000 in the Arab world, but it applied for registration in 2004 and never got it. So we actually, when people first came together to form it and to come up with the name, it was a full 4 years before. And I can tell you that we've been operating for approximately 20 plus years without formal registration because we never subscribed to the idea that registration equals legitimacy. Now, obviously, it has been incredibly difficult to navigate the often incredibly bureaucratic considerations of funding and of having a bank account and all of that, but that has never stopped us. In fact, it has allowed for a lot of maneuvering when it comes to pushing the envelope. When you're not registered, it has the added sort of benefit of people not being able to sue you, because who are they going to sue? You don't really legally exist. So for the past 20 years, we've been able to do a lot of interventions that other sort of established organizations couldn't get away with. And I wanted to really stress on something that Dr. Masri was talking about, which is this generational gap, and to stress that the LGBTQ rights movement didn't start with the establishment of Helm, far from it. There have been activists and heroes and people and giants that we stand on their shoulders all the way back to the early 1970s, with so much activism during the Civil War. The only issue is that it was never framed as LGBTQ activism, or there wasn't even an LGBTQ movement, or this compartmentalization of identities as this alphabet mafia of LGBTQIA++, all the way down. That was never the way it was. That was never the way it manifested on the ground, particularly because when you actually look at what's going on in the region, and I have to say that there has been a dearth of serious academic engagement with the history of queer movements and queerness in this part of the world outside of the post-colonial framework for a very long time, which I think it's high time we diversify the availability of information. You will find that there's been a rich history that has been purposefully obscured. What I'm talking about particularly came to light when we did a project last year, which we're going to unveil in a few months, in which we've gotten sort of an amalgamation of an oral history of trans women in Beirut above the age of 55 and 60, in order for them to show us through their lens of their experience what was Beirut like during the Civil War and even before. And you will find that this piece of history is so crucial for our work now to prove that the mythology of us being a Western importation is false, for us to prove that the fact that LGBTQ activism has been a byproduct of, Western intervention or the human rights industry or the gay international or whatever sort of paradigms that have existed in order to justify why this resurgence had happened. It happened, and people hear about it because of the internet, because of social media. And that has allowed us to have conversations that we previously were sequestered in very small areas of the city which you had to be very privileged and very lucky and part of the community and very brave part of the community to have access to. So I will conclude in saying, and going back to the conversation regarding identity, is that identity is incredibly important, and people have agency to identify the way they want to identify. You want to identify as gay, even though that is, or LGBTIQ, even though that's seen in some circles as a Western form of identification, you have the agency to do so. And if you don't want to, if you want to subscribe to something that is not compartmentalized, that is, I don't know, a more regional or quote unquote authentic, then you also have the agency to do that. I don't understand why people can't have the agency to do both and do what it is that they need to do. But what I can tell you is that centralizing identity as a strategic sort of inevitability in terms of how do you operate as an NGO or how do you operate in this movement isn't necessarily always the right way to go, because you have to understand that sometimes strategically, without compromising identity, you have to operate differently. When you're talking about socioeconomic rights, I don't go to labor rights activists and say, hello, you're a labor rights activist, I'm a queer person, what can you do for me? What has worked and me going to them and saying, hi, I'm a queer person and I'm here to work for the labor rights movement for everybody. What is my role? That has been the way, that has been the key in changing the conversation and then finally sparking movement in rights work in a place like Lebanon. I sense you have something to say. I had one more point to say, but I think I'll
No, make the point. I was just going to say, what moved me in what you've just said is that we need to perhaps start thinking less about intersectionality and identity and more about connectionality and coalition, right? In terms of strategies. Because there's a sense in which, and this is a global phenomenon, we are all dealing with the cost and consequences of an exclusive focus on a political frame that not only centers identity, but is preoccupied with identity to the exclusion of everything else, and doesn't look at positionality.
I completely agree.
And linked fates and shared interests. So make your next point, and then we're going to open things up for questions from our participants.
You gave me a very comfortable way of actually making it, because you sort of introduced it. This idea of intersectionality has become a buzzword, and we've forgotten what a massive responsibility it is. When you're bringing in together people from diverse backgrounds, enormous diverse backgrounds, not just SOGSC-based diversity, but political diversity, ethnic diversity, and you're putting them all in a single public space for a political purpose, you are creating a pressure cooker environment, which you need to know how to handle. You need to know how to work with spaces like that, with holding environments that can withstand the enormous pressure of diversity, and in order to be able to work intersectionally. We sometimes forget that discrimination also operates horizontally, not just vertically. We need to understand that we are multiple communities that are processing trauma and discrimination, and often we let it out on each other. Now, if you're in the business of building power with communities that have that experience, whether it's through their sexuality or through their ability or through their race or through their sect or religion, you name it, you better figure out a way in order to talk about and to process this in order to build power to actually solve public problems. And that is something that we're still working our way through. We're still trying to figure it out, not just in the global south, but in the global north as well. And it's really important to have these conversations in spaces like this that bring together people from our part of the world, folks in the United States, folks working on multiple identity-based movements in order to figure this out.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to go, unfortunately, I seem to have clicked on a button, as sometimes happens when I'm on my computer, which is pulled up a screen that I do not want to see. So I'm trying to get out of it. I'm back to where I want to be. So I'm looking at some wonderful questions. I think for purposes of context, perhaps because Tark, you referred obliquely to this, we should say a little bit, if you're comfortable with speaking about the topic, about the circumstances in which this event kind of migrated digitally, particularly in light of the earlier discussion that we had around language and framing and visibility. The panel's rescheduling and framing as one question is written, I'm quoting, as an event about the rights of sexual deviants by mainstream Jordanian news media seems highly relevant to the topic at hand. We have a culture war going on here in the United States around transgender rights and critical race theory. A culture war, it seems, going on in Amman around the rights of sexual and gender minorities. How do we think about, I'm tempted to say not naming and framing, but aiming and framing, right? As part of the politics of language, and the battle for control of the narrative about the human justice movements of what I will call, for lack of a better term, using the dreaded alphabet, LGBTQ freedom. How do you feel about the fact that this is not the conversation that was originally planned, and that we were forced to improvise and be creative about the platform that would be available to us for having this conversation today? Tark, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to you, Dalia, and then Hamdi.
Okay, I guess I'll start, and I'll try to be, as honest as possible. Listen, this sort of work and these sort of spaces are going to receive a lot of resistance, but that is basically why we do what we do. Something that Dalia just said earlier really resonates with me, which is the necessity to speak about the purposefully unspoken, to really confront people with reality. And that is, reality is incredibly difficult for people to look into. They will try as much as possible to deny the fact that this reality exists, and they will erect whatever mythologies they can. I personally adopt this sort of approach by reminding people that LGBTQ people, queer people, whatever it is you want to call us, have always existed. Not only have we always existed, but we've always been part and parcel of the movements and the societies that make up the modern region. And there's no denying that. History proves that, fact proves that. When it comes to this particular event and why it was, postponed, well, first of all, it was 4 speakers speaking about LGBTQ rights in a center that was based in Jordan without a single Jordanian speaker. And that should speak volumes as to what is permissible and what isn't there. And one of the things that we wanted to be very careful of is to not compromise the position and the trajectory and the work and the sort of the power and the decision-making of Jordanian activists, and also being part of this narrative and also co-authoring this narrative with us. And we don't run, we go, we sort of walk all together. So in one way, we couldn't do it where we wanted to do it, but we still were able to do it. And hopefully folks that were going to attend the other event attended this one. We still said what we wanted to say without compromising. I'm very glad that some homophobes got their panties in a bunch and we still managed to make this event and not compromise on it. We will always do that. But at the same time, I listen to my Jordanian siblings as an ally to their movement. As all allies, I listen and I support and I do what they believe, they diagnose, they deem to be important, they deem to be effective, they deem to be impactful in how the trajectory of their own movement is. So I wouldn't have done it any other way.
Thank you. Hamdi, would you like to say a word about a final word of your choice? You're muted, Hamdi. Yeah.
Sorry. Final thanks. Sure. These movements in the MENA region are, literally young, and they tend to attract young people, and it's very important at this point to actually these movements have been kind of preoccupied with integration at a horizontal level with all the different letters that we talked about, including everyone in this spectrum, and less preoccupied with the vertical one, that is more about age and social class, education, everything. So it's very important to have that, work on that, and to try to include people from different walks of life with different backgrounds and different ages and different, educational backgrounds. So it's very important. And it's very important also to never, ever stop the conversation, no matter what. Try to keep that going so that it's part of the conversation, the public spheres, but also politically. One telling example, Tunisia, it's the last presidential elections, where candidates were asked specifically about where they stand in terms of Article 260 of the Penal Code and homosexuality. So it's very important to keep that and to use any possible opportunity, including, chaotic democratic transitions and revolutions. So that's my final words.
Thank you, Hamdi. Dalia, the final word.
The final word. I think it's quite important to know that a movement is not just one organization. A movement is people. People working together to achieve mutual goals, who believe in the same values. But I think that it's quite important. I think it's very crucial right now, at this stage we're in, that there are some organizations kind of gatekeeping and kind of silencing different activists and initiatives. They need to give space and let different individuals express their understanding of the movement and their needs from the movement and their role, and like fulfill the role in the movement. So I think this is what would lead to change. There is no one way to change or to make a positive difference in the situation we are in, on a local or regional level. And last thing I want to say, Sarah Hegazi identified as a communist before she identified as lesbian. So, I mean, back to this very concrete identity politics, we also need to ask the right questions about when it comes to identity, and to see people beyond what we want, what we wish from them. Because Sarah raising the flag is not everything about Sarah, neither anybody else. Needing a queer activist doesn't mean this is the only thing, or the human rights struggle I fight for. So I think it's quite important to identify as not just in a generalistic and a specific way altogether.
Thank you. Let me just say again what an honor it has been for me to be in conversation with the four of you, and to extend my gratitude to the Columbia Global Centers for providing us with a platform on which to have this important conversation. I am persuaded that it is a necessary conversation, not only for what we can learn from you, but what we can learn about ourselves, doing the work that we're doing, where we're doing it, and where we can identify those opportunities for coalitional work and for creative thinking across identities, across experiences, across geographical locations, to build a global human justice movement in which all people are able to live their whole integrated lives with dignity and in justice. So I will turn the mic, as it were, over to Safwan Masri for concluding remarks.
Thank you, Kendall. Thank you, Hamdi, Dalia, Tariq, and Rasha. I mean, this has been incredible, and I wish that we had many more hours to engage in it. Let me just say a couple of comments in response to some of what I've heard, which I think are really important. I mean, one, to your point, Tariq, about the academic discourse. It is blossoming, and you have people like Saeed Atchan, you have people like Tariq Mahoni, who are writing increasingly about this and who are challenging the existing post-colonialism sort of scholarship on it that deprives, I think, people like yourselves of the agency that you spoke very powerfully about. Okay, you have, I mean, you know, or attempts to deprive that agency. There's a very, very rich present and history to all of those issues, and there shouldn't be sort of, you know, one mandated discourse, of course, on how we deal with it. Even though this is not my field of scholarship, but it is my field of interest, and I just dropped in the chat box an article that I recently published in the Brown Journal of International Affairs on this specific issue and on the movement. I sit in awe, really, of the energy and courage that you all have. And I repeat again that, you know, people like myself are there to support and to be sensitive to and not presume sort of to know the issues on the ground. We dealt with this last week also, as we were in touch with some of the activists in Jordan who often have to work underground in order to be effective. And there's tremendous respect for the strategies and the tactics that are necessary, that are pursued by different individuals and groups. And I think, as you might have said, Dalia, earlier, there's a lot that gets transferred between countries, among countries within the region, but there are lots of idiosyncrasies as well. Okay, we cannot look at the region as a monolith. Perhaps, I mean, one idea that I have had is we should have another session just focusing, because one of the questions in the Q&A that really piqued my interest is what can be learned from the Palestine or Palestine-Israel scenario, Al-Qaws, for example, and how it deals with you know, Palestinian advocacy against a very authoritarian regime. How does it deal with and how does it navigate issues that then intersect with what's called pinkwashing and Israel? What happens within Israeli politics? You know, Aida Touma Sleiman is a, you know, Dalia, when you said that Sarah identified first as a communist, Aida identifies first as a communist, and she's been a very effective politician and member of Knesset, and she came under attack from other factions within the Joint Arab List because of her advocacy for gay rights and because she joined marches by Palestinian citizens of Israel. I'll also say, just going back to Tariq's point about scholarship, this is part of a series, and one of the upcoming events is actually going to project gay literary authors from within the region. So really looking forward to having that. I'll end, Kendall, by really owing you, you know, by saying how much I owe you in terms of gratitude for curating and facilitating this fantastic conversation. And I'll borrow from what Tariq has said, given what we faced last week and the fact that we stuck to our guns. We held this conversation, and when I was told, Tariq, that you couldn't join at all because you had another event, I said, well, when does his other event finish? And they said at 11 a.m. Eastern time. I said, bring him on. And I'm glad you came. We have had the added benefit of having Kendall as the moderator. And I think what you said earlier, we would not have it any other way. So with that, thank you. And all the more power to you, young men and women. I'm in awe. Thank you. Thank you, Kendall.
Thank you for having us. And
Thank you.
pleasure to see my siblings, Dalia and Hamdi. Big kisses to you guys.
Thank you.
Soon.
And thanks to our
Pandemic willing.
audience.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.